must face, without panic, the reality of our times. The fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities.
In the months after World War II, a Cold War began between the Soviet Union, the United States, and their allies.
Each side was suspicious of the other, and they were afraid they were going to be wiped out by a nuclear first strike.
In response, the U.S. developed clandestine military sites.
We did accept these conditions. Keep your mouth shut. Your lives or other lives depend on it.
The secrecy around these programs fed a growing hysteria.
It's the only time in the history of the United States where the government has said, we've got a flying saucer.
While the CIA committed medical atrocities using mind control and deadly nerve agents.
I didn't know what sheer terror there is in being trapped and not being able to breathe properly. And I now, even today, I have nightmares about it.
Hidden for decades, America's secret missions are now in full view.
It's quite clear that the government resorted to very extreme measures in keeping this quiet.
Roswell, New Mexico, July 8, 1947. Local radio host Frank Joyce received a visitor, Lieutenant Walter Holt, press officer for America's only nuclear bomb squad, the 509th, stationed at Roswell.
He owed me a story. I had complained to him recently about he had given a story to somebody else, and I'd been left off the list. So he brings this in. I picked it up, and as I glanced, I knew instantly it was the man on the phone.
2 days earlier, Frank Joyce had spoken with a local rancher who had discovered unusual debris in one of his fields. The press release remarkably stated that the U.S. Army Air Corps had recovered a flying disc from a ranch north of Roswell. Frank Joyce drew only one conclusion.
The U.S. Army Air Corps says they have a flying saucer. It's got to be from outer space.
Joyce broadcast the extraordinary story to his local audience. It was possibly the biggest news scoop of all time.
It's still the only time in the history of the United States where the government has said, we've got a flying saucer.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
The release revealed few other details. It said that a local couple had seen an unusual craft in the sky on July 2nd. Major Jesse Marcel had recovered the debris, and it was now being taken to higher military headquarters. The incredible story was quickly picked up and released around the world.
As soon as this story came out, all hell broke loose. New York calls, London calls. God, the world wanted to know about this.
The concept of flying discs, or flying saucers, had caught the world's attention just 2 weeks earlier. On June 24th, a respected pilot, Kenneth Arnold, reported seeing 9 objects flying over Mount Rainier, like saucers skipping over a pond.
Well, at about 2:15, I took off from Chehalis, Washington, and I noticed to the left of me a chain which looked to me like the tail of a Chinese kite. They looked something like a pie plate that was cut in half with a sort of a convex triangle in the rear.
Even though Arnold described the craft as having bat-like wings, the image of a flying saucer lodged with the public, and the term stuck. Over the next few weeks, hundreds of sightings of these new flying saucers were reported. The breaking news that one had been recovered near Roswell would at last unravel a mystery on the minds of anxious millions. What were these craft? How did they travel so fast? And were they from this world? Or another? Once the story reached the Roswell Army airfield, 2 intelligence officers were dispatched to evaluate and collect the debris. Major Jesse Marcel and plainclothes officer Captain Sheridan Cabot filled several sacks with the material. The mystery material was flown to Fort Worth, Texas for analysis. 4 hours later, a press conference was called by Base Commander General Roger Ramey. He told the media that contrary to earlier reports, the debris was from nothing more than a weather balloon and certainly not a flying saucer. Major Marcel, who had collected the material, posed with the mundane-looking debris. The public quickly accepted the military's explanation.
Most people don't realize that back 60 years ago, things were a lot different than they are today. If you were told by the government that it was a pink elephant, you would accept that.
Overnight, one of the greatest headline stories became nothing but a footnote. And it may have remained a footnote forever, if it weren't for one eyewitness whose testimony would reopen the Roswell case and shock the world.
So, tell me what happened back in 1947.
In late 1978, a UFO researcher was introduced to retired Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who'd collected debris from the original crash site.
Went out to that field.
Marcel declared that there had been a cover-up. He said that the weather balloon material shown to the press had been switched. What he'd found in Roswell in 1947 was not from this planet.
I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a spaceship. Maybe there were aliens out there. I don't know. But I know it wasn't a weather balloon.
Since 1978, over 100 witnesses have been persuaded to talk. Many of them, like George Newling, offer little more than glimpsed memories.
What I seen, it wasn't made in this world.
17-year-old Private Newling was working on B-29s at Roswell in 1947 when he remembers catching sight of something he thinks was part of a spaceship.
The first thing that caught my eye was this object that was in the bomb racks, and it was the color that fascinated me. It was a gray, but nothing I've ever seen then or before or after.
Witnesses described a huge military recovery operation.
50 to 60 troops are up at the debris field on hands and knees, shoulder to shoulder, picking up every last shard of that wreck.
Yeah, that's good.
Others claim that the military ransacked media offices as part of a cover-up.
We have numerous accounts from the radio stations as well as the newspapers describing how military MPs went from office to office, confiscating, ransacking desks and file cabinets.
There were also reports of witnesses being threatened to keep the story quiet, including the rancher who found the wreckage.
He's sworn to secrecy. He was, by all accounts, a broken man. It's quite clear that the government resorted to very extreme measures in keeping this quiet.
In 1947, saucer sightings were pouring in from around the country. Hundreds of them in just a few weeks. But there might have been a reason people were scanning the skies. With World War II just over, the Cold War was beginning.
There had been all this rocket development during the war, and people were already talking about you might be able to use rockets not just to go from, Germany to England, but you could use rockets to go to the moon or beyond. The idea of space travel, which had only been fiction up until that point, was suddenly something that you could actually do. And now, suddenly, people see things in the sky. Not surprising, there were a lot of things in the sky. So I think the fact that the aliens decided to visit beginning in the 1940s, I think that that's more a reflection of the state of our own knowledge and our own technology.
The 1947 wave of sightings led to plenty of speculation. Some about new Soviet weapons, some about visitors from outer space. Hundreds of UFO movies, books, and comics played to the public's fascination.
Here we had flying saucers, aliens, and spaceship playing on television and movies, and while they were frightening, they were entertainment that took us away from the real fear, which was the Russians.
1 year after the wave of UFO sightings, the Pentagon responded with an investigation known as Project Blue Book to gather military and civilian testimony. Just 12 months after the supposed Roswell incident, a Project Blue Book advisory committee met in secret to discuss their findings. Colonel Howard McCoy, Chief of Intelligence for the Army, confirmed at the secret meeting that the military had never recovered a flying saucer.
He then went on to make a statement that is devastating to the Roswell case. McCoy said, and I quote, "I can't even tell you how much we would give to have one of those crash in an area so that we could recover whatever they are."
If the alien story of Roswell were true, such a recovery would certainly have generated a huge military paper trail. But the only proof of UFO claims comes from witness accounts.
This long list of witnesses is very curious because they didn't come out of the closet, so to speak, until the 1980s when Roswell became the Roswell incident, the mecca of ufology. And that tells us more about modern myth-making than it does about eyewitness accounts.
Throughout the 1980s, suspicion of a cover-up fueled the Roswell legend. Then in the early 90s, two UFO researchers, Carl Flock and Robert Todd, unearthed a top-secret mission that had long been forgotten. It offered a much simpler and earthly solution to the Roswell mystery. After America exploded the first atomic bomb in 1945, it was only a matter of time until the Soviets would develop their own nuclear program. In 1947, testing began on an American secret spying program called Project Mogul. The highly classified mission was set up to listen out for any Soviet atomic test.
Mogul was so classified, we didn't know what the classification was.
In fact, Mogul was classified as 1A, the same as the H-bomb program. Project Mogul would use some 50 large rubber balloons to carry listening devices, called transponders, into the higher atmosphere. Up here, sound moved much quicker, and a nuclear explosion could, in theory, be detected, even on the other side of the world.
I know it worked because I saw a beautiful signal come in one day from the Pacific, and it was an American nuclear bomb explosion, and I was tracking it right here in New Mexico.
In 1947, B.D. Gildenberg was a young engineering undergraduate at New York University when the military commissioned his department to work on Project Mogul. The Mogul team started to gather the materials needed for the project. One item that they farmed out to a Brooklyn toy manufacturer was the kite-like radar reflectors called Raywin targets. These would be used in order to track the balloon's movements, and the team needed hundreds of them. They were essentially six-pronged kites with a balsa wood frame, covered with silver foil and backed with strong white material. In June 1947, the NYU team traveled with all their equipment to White Sands Testing Range in New Mexico. From this remote desert location, they began experimental launches of their new top-secret mission.
This was the first time that constant level balloons were used in the United States, which we were still learning about and still experimenting with.
On June 4th, test flight number 4 was launched in mid-afternoon. But due to cloud cover, the Mogul team soon lost it on both radar and spotter plane as it drifted northeast towards Roswell. The free-trailing device was some 600 feet long, twice the height of the Statue of Liberty. With up to 50 large balloons, 9 shiny Raywin targets, ballast controls, and transponders, it would have looked very different from a weather balloon. Eventually, the neoprene rubber balloons disintegrated, showering the desert below. Although the mission was top secret, the equipment itself was of little value, and the Mogul team deemed its recovery low priority. The rancher's description of the debris being of rubber, silver foil, and balsa wood, and there being lots of it, matches Project Mogul perfectly. The photographs of the debris clearly show similar items. Today, Project Mogul is accepted among most scientists as the rational answer to the Roswell mystery. From June 1947 onwards, hundreds of top-secret high-altitude balloons were launched all over America. The balloons and payloads were ever more bizarre. B.D. Gildenberg believes that these balloons were what many people were mistaking for alien crafts.
I remember the CIA being at some of our launches, and they were the ones who were pushing this. Said, yeah, let these remain UFO reports as a cover-up for all these secret programs that were coming on board.
One military site renowned for its secrecy held some of the most classified programs of the Cold War. Established by the CIA in 1955 to develop and test America's most secret military projects, Area 51 was named after a grid number on a map. Satellite images of the Nevada desert show 7 runways and more than 25 hangars. Shrouded in secrecy, access has always been highly restricted. Area 51 was built around a dry lake bed known as Groom Lake. It offered obvious advantages.
Well, we needed a good place to land, that we could land any direction, depending on where the wind came from, and the round lake served that purpose. It was also protected with the mountain range around it, so it wasn't very visible.
Smooth as glass. Just unbelievable. I could take that staff car out there as fast as it'd go, and it wouldn't even make a bump.
We had a bunch of trailers for us to live in. And we had a all-purpose building where you eat, didn't have TV, didn't even have a radio. Paradise Ranch was the first name that was given to the establishment. They thought it would soften the blow of the austerity. It was an attempt to perhaps convince people it wasn't quite as bad as it looked.
Area 51 was created for one top-secret project called Aquatone. In 1955, men from the CIA, the Air Force, and a secret division of Lockheed came to Paradise Ranch to begin work.
All they would tell us was we had to go for a pressure suit, so we knew it was going to be high-altitude stuff. Your blood boils above 50,000 without having pressurization. So if you were to lose pressurization, just your engine conk out and you're above 50, that suit saves you.
When pilots fly higher than man has ever flown, equipment changes are necessary.
In this declassified footage, Ray Gowdy prepares for a flight inside Area 51. The men looked like nothing seen on Earth, and rumors about what was going on inside Area 51 started to swirl.
It was so secret, I didn't know what it was until I got there and wondered what I got myself into.
The men were testing one of the most important tools of the Cold War, the U-2 spy plane.
There was no trainer, there was no two-seater, there was no simulator.
The U-2 was equipped with high-resolution cameras designed to fly at 70,000 feet and take photographs from the edge of the stratosphere. As the Cold War arms race with the Soviet Union intensified, the U-2 was America's best hope for tracking their rivals' growing nuclear arsenal. And it put enormous demands on pilots, who had to breathe pure oxygen to survive at such heights.
Pilots find the confines of the helmet and faceplate conducive to claustrophobia. A number of pilots have been dropped from the program because of this single factor.
The government's cover story for the U-2 was that it was being used for weather research.
If not conventional aircraft, then what did they see?
The U-2 cruised at 3 times the height of regular airliners and would sometimes be glimpsed by civilians.
But I believe I saw the sun glinting off of windows or observation portholes of sort.
In the mid-1950s, while both the Cold War and America's interest in UFOs were at their peak,
I think it was from outer space, but friendly.
The silver-colored plane sometimes created confusion.
It was pure aluminum, and we said, hey, we look like a bright star up there.
Pilots were told to deny everything, even to aircraft controllers.
There are stories about seeing something flying way above. They may have called it in, but they'll still get nothing other than evasive stuff.
If you get up along the Canadian border, the ground controller wanted to question my altitude. Actually, he was pretty accurate. And I says, no, you got to recalibrate your weapon. That's not the altitude we're at.
By 1957, unacknowledged U-2 flights were the source of half of all reported UFO sightings. But they were nothing compared to what would come. Area 51 was established in one of the most isolated regions of the country. And in the early days, all outside access came through the desk of security agent Richard Mingus.
All calls came in to Area 51 to that desk. That was the only number in and out of Area 51. I would answer the phone, and I'm not going to give you the correct number here. It's 656, Inspector Mingus. That's it. If they ask me if Charlie Jones works there, I don't know. It was a really touchy thing, but I would never confirm nor deny a name over that phone. Nor would I give my location or give any idea as to what we're doing out there, referring it to an air base or anything of that nature.
This insistence on total secrecy was fueled by Cold War paranoia and the widespread fear that the Soviet Union might destroy the United States.
Each side was suspicious of the other, and they were afraid they were going to be wiped out by a nuclear first strike.
Driven by Cold War pressures, the U.S. worried that Area 51's founding project, the U-2, had become vulnerable to Soviet missiles.
The plan was to have a manned aircraft successor to the U-2 with far less vulnerability and with greater capability. Very few people at the agency at CIA knew about it.
Prototyped at a Lockheed facility in Burbank, California, and transported to Area 51 in disguise, the newest top-secret project was named Oxcart.
We walked over to the hangar, and windows up top were just the only place that emitted any light. You could see back in the shadows this long, beautiful airplane. Just amazing. First thing you'd think is a spaceship.
There's a lot of things that people really don't need to know. And this is why Area 51 is such a mythical situation, because they don't know what's going on.
Much about Oxcart was classified for decades. The world's first stealth plane, designed to be nearly impossible for enemies to detect on radar.
The test that I was involved in involved an Oxcart flying over that radar station. And the basic idea was to find out if they could fly over without being detected. I went into the radar control building to watch what would happen when the thing went over. Well, I was standing there and nobody could see much happening. All of a sudden, it sounded like a ladder or something fell over on the roof. What it was a shock wave from the airplane. They had not seen it on the radars. It certainly seemed like it was doing its job.
The Oxcart could fly coast to coast in 70 minutes, but its sole purpose was to spy. These images taken over North Korea were released by the CIA and reveal how well the Oxcart could photograph objects on the ground from 90,000 feet while traveling 2,200 miles an hour. But at the height of the Cold War, America wasn't the only one with powerful cameras.
We had a satellite tracking setup, and we were alerted to the time when the satellite was supposed to pass over.
So as they were approaching our area, we would shut everything down.
And if a plane happened to be out in the open while the satellite was coming over the horizon, they would shoot it into that building.
To test the Oxcart's stealth properties, workers would sometimes need to leave a model outside on a pylon. And with the Soviets spying from above, this presented a problem.
If you had a plane up on a pylon, it was pretty hard to disguise it from satellites.
So we had no way of handling the situation but taking the mock-up down off of the pole, putting it away in a hangar, and then taking it back out and putting it back up.
It gets to be quite a hassle.
Despite efforts to hide the secret aircraft, intelligence agents discovered that the Soviet Union had a drawing of the plane and had found a way to detect Oxcart.
Most of the testing that we did in the daylight, radiation from the sun would heat up everything except the shadow. If we left the mock-up stationary for a half an hour or so, it might leave a shadow that an infrared camera could pick up.
Soon the men at Area 51 were intentionally devising fakes for the Soviets to discover.
We used the infrared satellites for coming over, and we would draw the outline of some kind of exotic plane in front of one of the hangars. Most of them was out of cardboard. Just before the satellite got there, we'd have a couple of heaters in the rear end of it to make it receive a heat signature as though the plane had just landed. We always wanted them to think we had something that they didn't. And they would sure spend a lot of time and money to try to figure out what it was.
In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen.
Deceptions designed to protect Oxcart fueled the rumors about Area 51.
Jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope.
We flew 2,850 missions out of Groom Lake, Area 51, that no one knew about. The plane did not exist. And naturally, the sunlight just right, it would be spotted, and it would become a genuine UFO sighting.
General Sanford, Air Force Intelligence Director, confirms that the objects are not secret American weapons and reiterates the Air Force's obligation to investigate.
This was during the era that the Air Force was doing Project Blue Book, investigating UFO sightings. They started investigating, and all of a sudden they'd run up there against this wall of security. I said, whoa, that's a top secret mission. You got to make a cover story and forget it happened.
We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports.
So Project Blue Book, the poor guys, they would have to manufacture a story to explain that sighting.
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin.
There are a lot of situations people cannot know that they're not true. So I think that there's been an awful lot of misinformation, but it's been fed by people's natural curiosity. If you don't know what's going on, you might like to find out.
Often, even the wildest speculation contains threads of truth, like theories of reverse engineering alien spacecraft.
We did reverse engineer things out there. It was a Russian MiG-21. And we got it in 1968, and we tore it apart, see how the Russians built it, and then put it back together, and we flew it.
Even the conspiracy theory that the government staged the moon landing at Area 51 has a slight basis in fact.
It was on the atomic testing grounds. We tested our land rover that we sent to the moon. We tested all of the life support systems. The astronauts came out here and trained in the atomic bomb craters. So that's probably where some of those crazy stories come from.
The only thing we know for sure is that we'll never know everything.
I'm telling you about 5% of what went on.
I've only told you part of the story, seriously. I have to be honest.
As the Cold War raged, the superpowers fought for military and scientific supremacy. Espionage was the name of the game. The CIA embarked upon a multi-million-dollar, highly classified research program into the covert use of biological and chemical materials, an innocuous term for a frightening array of unorthodox weapons. Bacteria to infect the enemy, poisons for assassinations, truth drugs for interrogations. Spearheading these clandestine efforts was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, head of the CIA's top-secret chemical division. Gottlieb worked closely with Army scientists at Fort Detrick, Maryland, developing biological weapons for the agency's use.
Included in the medicine chest at Fort Detrick would have been anthrax, the plague, brucellosis, all the major diseases.
Together, the CIA and the Army's special operations planned experiments on the dispersal of their new biological weapons. More than once, they simulated an attack on an entire city. One target, the nation's most populous metropolis, New York. The intention, to evaluate how easy it would be to poison a city by releasing bacteria into the subway system. Staff from Fort Detrick, posing as industrial contractors, positioned themselves over the subway vents. They surreptitiously dropped harmless bacteria onto the tracks, while monitoring agents waited to take samples throughout the network. Turbulence from the trains quickly carried the germs through the tunnels, infecting the entire subway system in a matter of minutes. With a more lethal substance, a similar attack on an enemy city could be efficient and deadly. The CIA was not alone in its effort to develop new weapons against the communists. America formed a tripartite agreement with Canada and Great Britain, the three nations working together to win the Cold War. British research into biochemical warfare was carried out at the Army base in Porton Down, southwest England.
Porton Down led the world in biochemical research during the 30s and 40s. Porton Down knew about the attempt to infiltrate the subway system in New York. There was a constant exchange of information. It was very normal on any given day to find one or more American scientists at Porton Down.
In May 1953, scientists at Porton Down were researching one of the most lethal nerve agents known to man, sarin. The experiments were conducted on military volunteers, but the young servicemen had no idea what they were letting themselves in for.
On the board, there was a separate notice typed, which said in so many words, volunteers wanted to help find a cure for the common cold. Those taking part will receive extra pay.
By volunteering, Ken Earl became an unsuspecting guinea pig in the war against the Soviets. On May 4th at Porton Down, he and 5 other men were led into a small room by 2 technicians.
We were told by the 2 men to roll up the left sleeve so the left arm was exposed. These 2 men then took 2 pieces of material and they taped them to our forearm. They then gave us each a respirator and that we were not, under any circumstances, to take off the respirator. And the door was sealed behind us. It was very, very poky, a small building. And I found out since it was a gas chamber, which puts the fear of death into you, of course. This technician, with a vial and a pipette, went round each of us, and he dripped onto these pieces of material 20 drops in 2 rows. And it was a colourless liquid, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't question it.
The clear liquid was sarin nerve agent. It was quickly absorbed into the arm through the skin. The effects were immediate.
I became absolutely claustrophobic. I didn't know what sheer terror there is in being trapped and not being able to breathe properly. You feel you can't breathe. I was sweating profusely. And I felt so ill. And I now, even today, have nightmares about it. After half an hour, we were released, gasping and spluttering and sweating into the open air. Beautiful sunny May morning. Absolute bliss. What a wonderful thing to be alive.
The corresponding paperwork clearly stated the purpose of the experiment was to determine the lethal dose of sarin. They quickly got their answer.
2 days later, another group of 6 had exactly the same thing done to them. But sitting in my seat was a young 20-year-old called Ronald Madison. And, quite frankly, he was dead within 45 minutes, the most hideous death anybody can ever have. Foaming at the mouth, an ambulance driver described it as like frog spawn coming out of his mouth. Terrible death.
By summer 1953, the Korean War was ending. Shocking news flooded the airwaves. Captured American pilots confessed to dropping biological weapons on North Korea.
The germ bombs were loaded 15 minutes before our mission.
The U.S. vehemently denied the charge.
The United States has not and is not using germ warfare of any kind in Korea.
The communists must have brainwashed the pilots into false confessions. But how?
There was a real fear in the CIA that the communists had ways of doing things, of interrogating people, of making people act against their will, that could be breakthroughs.
To combat the new threat, the CIA launched its own intense quest to master the art of mind control.
They were looking for ways to manipulate and control human behavior. They looked at chemical substances. They looked at things like electroshock.
One drug in particular caught their attention, lysergic acid dithalamide, LSD.
The hope was you could use these drugs to soften up somebody for interrogation, or you could use them offensively for mind control programming and getting somebody set up for operations.
10 years before its recreational heyday, LSD became the focus of the CIA's quest for the perfect truth drug. At the Federal Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell was contracted by the CIA to study the effects of prolonged exposure to LSD. His subjects were incarcerated heroin addicts, mostly black.
The deal down there was unbelievably gauche. They had prisoner volunteers who came in, and they would be given LSD as part of the experimentation, and then as a reward given heroin.
In one experiment, prisoners were kept on increasing doses of LSD for 77 straight days. Even Dr. Isbell himself was amazed at how such high quantities of hallucinogens could be tolerated for so long.
A lot of these things just violate any kind of common sense and basic medical ethics. That you would think it would be impossible that doctors would do experiments on drug addicts, giving them hallucinogens, and then as a reward for participation, they would get more drugs of addiction. But these things actually happen. They're absolutely documented.
As the research into mind control intensified, brainwashing became the focus. The new goal was to cause an individual to become subservient to an imposed control, to the point where he would perform acts against his will and then have no memory of the act. To produce such an assassin, the CIA faced two main challenges: how to induce amnesia and how to program in new behavior. In 1957, Dr. Ewan Cameron, an eminent psychiatrist in Montreal, believed he had the answers.
The agency sought him out because they had noticed his work, in particular with two techniques: intensive electroshock and what he called psychic driving.
Cameron applied his technique under the guise of normal therapy.
It's hard to say just how awful and horrendous what Cameron proposed and what our government financed was. It was a three-part technique which started with an effort to wipe out past patterns of behavior. And this was accomplished through the use of particularly intensive, repeated, high-level electroshocks until no more convulsions could be elicited from a patient.
Cameron then played tape-recorded messages through helmets that were locked to his patients' heads. This psychic driving forced them to listen to repetitive statements for weeks on end to program in new behavior.
The final phase was to try to wipe out all recollection of what had happened, and that was accomplished by putting people to sleep for 30, 40 days, accompanied by different kinds of cocktails of drugs. Now, that's not any kind of therapy. That's a brainwashing experiment.
For 4 years, the CIA fully funded Cameron's work. But he wasn't alone. Psychiatrists throughout the nation, at hospitals, prisons, and some of the top universities, were similarly on the agency's payroll. The American public remained oblivious that the CIA's mind control program ever existed. But on June 11, 1975, the Washington Post reported on a civilian scientist who was unwittingly given LSD and jumped from a Manhattan hotel window. The source for the article was the Rockefeller Commission report, triggered by Watergate. It was a presidential inquiry into illicit domestic activities by the CIA. Spurred by the media reports, Congress launched its own investigation into the CIA, chaired by Senator Frank Church.
We had a hypnotist do some experiments, primarily to see what the limitations of hypnosis might be. Can you make a person do something under hypnosis that he would not ordinarily do?
The revelations were staggering. 80 institutions had been contracted by the CIA for mind control research, costing the taxpayer the equivalent of $30 million today. The committee concluded the agency demonstrated a fundamental disregard for the value of human life. In the fight against communism, the government sacrificed the rights of many individuals.
In the climate of the Cold War, or in all of human history, the basic motto is war is hell. And you've got to do a lot of bad stuff, and a lot of people die and get hurt. But we justify it because we need to do what we need to do to protect America. This is the bind that we're in as a culture. What can we justify in the name of national security? Can we justify medical atrocities? Apparently.